The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn series, sponsored by Peak Services, or LGAQ, as many of you would know the organisation. So welcome, wherever you are. We've got people from councils as far north as Weipa, right through to Gold Coast, and quite far west in Queensland. So wherever you're viewing this, welcome, warm welcome, and I hope you had fun completing your influencing capabilities profile. And if you haven't had a chance to complete your profile, you'll still get a chance to do that at the end of this presentation. But I strongly suggest you do, because it gives you a really good handle on your own influencing style and approach, and that is going to help you in terms of the work you do in local government. Okay, as usual, I just want to make sure that I'm being heard, because it's one thing me talking, but another thing for me to get through to people. Could you just please go to the question box on the right-hand side and just type in the word clear? So if I get several people saying clear, thank you, Catherine, thank you, Kelly. Okay, thank you, Peter, thank you, Emma, thank you, John. Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's obvious I'm coming through loud and clear, which is great. Thank you. All right, so let's get underway. And what I want to do now is just take a quick overview of the program, and let's understand what's in the series and what we've done and where we're going. So big picture, and then we can get stuck into the topic that we're covering today. So you might recall, of course, 2 weeks ago we did the Unit 1, which was the unit on the ingredients of effective feedback. And what I was really wanting you to do there is to practice giving 3 bits of feedback every single day. I hope you've had a chance to do that, and I hope you got some good results from that. Of course, feedback being authentic. But the only way you're going to change any behaviours in leadership is, of course, to apply what you've learned. So ironically, what happens between the sessions is critically important. So each time I give you some homework, it's really important that you try and apply the homework. And obviously out of today, it'll have something to do with influence or persuasion. And so we're up to Module 2 today, of course, and we'll go through all that shortly. In Module 3, we'll look at optimising team performance, because most of you have got a team you're working in local government. It's very important that you try to get the team working to its maximum capability, and we'll talk a little bit about how you do that. In Unit 4, it's about getting the very best from the people that work with you. So this isn't necessarily getting people to be working at 100% productivity. That's not always possible, but you can get someone who perhaps is working at a 60% productivity level to a 70% productivity level, or someone from a 40% productivity level to a 50% productivity level. So in other words, it's all about getting continuous improvement and performance from the people you're working with inside your organisation. That's the perennial challenge for anyone in a leadership role. So in Unit 5, I'm going to get you to do a second diagnostic, and this diagnostic is about understanding people and their personalities. So it's a personality diagnostic. The difference between that and the influencing capabilities profile is that this one won't be done online. I'll be sending you in my normal email a link where you can download and print off that diagnostic and complete it, and bring it along to session 5 so that I can debrief you on that. And of course, session 6 is on facilitating effective meetings. And I guess having a fair bit of exposure to local government, it's just meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting, isn't it? It never seems to end. And I think that a lot of the meetings we attend are quite dull and boring and are really not that productive. And I think if you are in a leadership role, if you're not now, you will be in a position where you're expected to facilitate meetings. And I think you should take a pride in doing that as well as you probably can. Why? Because it's costly. It's costly in the sense that people are not doing other work while they're in the meeting, and this is called an opportunity cost. It also means that to get a group of people to give up an hour of their time or whatever it might be, it better be worth their while. Otherwise, they lose interest very quickly in the meeting and, of course, unfortunately, in you as the leader or the facilitator of that meeting. So I'm going to talk about some very practical and easy to implement tools on how you can run more effective meetings. So that's the Lunch and Learn series, and I'm hoping you are enjoying it. I hope you enjoy today's broadcast, which of course is on enhancing your personal influence. Okay, and at any time, could I ask you please, what I'd like you to do is to type in your questions in the question box, because I'm keen to hear your questions. I'd like your interaction. It's the best way we can get people to interact. I unfortunately can't unmute everybody, because if we did that, we'd have a lot of background noise and probably a lot of complaints that I'm not being heard clearly. So could you do that? As soon as you can think of a question, comment, statement, type it into the question box there. I'll stop. I'm the only one that sees the question, just for your interest, and I'll read the question out and I'll respond to it live. And that way, when you think about it, you're not going to forget it later on, because I'm not going to give a sort of a 10-minute break at the end. That's not the way I like to operate. It's more around keeping it interactive. So I'd ask you to do that. So what are we doing today? Well, there's 4 basic things that I'd like to cover in today's broadcast. First of all, I want to talk about what influence is and what influence isn't. When I mention the word influence, a lot of people think about being underhanded or cunning or manipulative. It's none of those things in my view. Influence is to be done transparently and ethically, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my definition of influence very shortly. Then I'm going to actually talk a little bit around the influencing capabilities framework. And if you've done the profile, and I think most of you have, checking the numbers, then the profile, I'll talk a little bit about how you can get the best out of that profile, because there's a lot of really rich data in there that can be very, very useful for you if you're looking to improve your leadership and influencing capability. We'll look at the 4 influencing strategies, and at this stage you'd probably be aware of your favourite influencing strategy, and we'll look at the other 3, because it's important, I guess, for you to be influential in a flexible way. So the whole idea of this is to try to use all 4 strategies, depending on the situation, of course, and depending on the people that you're trying to influence. And then what I want to do is wrap up with some tools of influence. So these are tools that you can apply immediately, virtually this afternoon if necessary, and you can start on these tools and start to build up your influencing capability. Okay, so hopefully that's all clear to everyone, what we're trying to do here. Let's move on. Now, you will notice that there on this screen, it'll come up on your screen very soon. Here it comes. There it goes, and there it comes. Okay. You'll notice that there are 4 historical characters on this slide. Now, you may know who they are. They're certainly well known, and you'll certainly be able to recognize their faces. And my question to you is, what do they all have in common? So what do these people all have in common? And they do have certain traits in common. All right, well, first of all, one of them's alive, 3 of them are dead. You will notice that each of them has had an enormous impact in our world. they have been enormously influential, I should say, and they've had great impact worldwide. And these aren't my heroes, I might point out. These are people that I've included in my book, The New Influencing Toolkit, not because I necessarily agree with their politics or I believe in the causes. I put them in there because they are or have been hugely influential. They've also been very controversial. All four of them are not short of controversy. But the fact of the matter is, all of them have achieved great things in their life. And that's why I'm going to use them as examples. So in your influencing capabilities profile, if you click on the icons, you will get some video clips of each of these four leaders, and they will just demonstrate to you their influence in action. So it might be an interview or a speech or whatever. You'll find that you'll see their style that they represent very clear in those video clips. So I'd urge you to do that. All right, so the reason I'm mentioning this up front, of course, is that we will be referring to those four as we go through this afternoon. We've just got a question here, so I'll respond to that. Okay. Oh, thanks, Kelly. You were saying, what do they all have in common? Yeah, absolutely. Passion. Thank you for using and clear visions. Absolutely, you're 100% right. Yes, they all had a very clear vision of what they wanted in our world. Okay, let's move on. Now, I did mention before that people do have misunderstandings about what influence is. So this is my definition of influence, and you'll find that there are myriad definitions of influence out there, but to me, it's the power to make other people agree with your opinions or get them to do what they want ethically and willingly. Now, a couple of things in that which are important. Influencing people can mean changing people's thinking or changing people's behaviour or both. So it's about that, and it's also done willingly. And what I mean by that is it's the other person's choice about whether they're influenced. So they actually willingly are prepared to be influenced. In other words, it's not about manipulation. And it's done ethically in the sense that people understand it's done transparently and so forth. So let's be absolutely clear about that before we launch into the whole world of influence, because it's really an honourable intent. And I should say to you that all of us are in the business of influence, whether we like it or not. It's true that we all are in that business. So, and that's precisely what the next slide will show up as. And I think what I would say to you all as employees and managers and what have you of local government, I would say that all of you are in the business of influence. And I would ask you to take that seriously, because if you're not influencing other people are trying to influence you. The whole world revolves around the whole notion of influence. When you go home tonight, if you've got children, you're trying to influence them. When you go home tonight, if you've got a partner, you're trying to influence them. When you go out socially with your friends, you're trying to influence them. So this is an ongoing exercise. So the logic is, why don't we become good at it? And people who are leaders are what I would refer to as professional influencers. Okay, so a couple of key things. And I'd also say to you this, that when you're trying to influence somebody, there are three important elements in any influential situation. And it's good to think about these. The first important variable is your influencing style and approach. Each of us has a particular style and approach. Now, how do you know what that is? Well, obviously, that's what the influencing capabilities profile is about. It's giving you a handle on what your style and approach is. And more than likely, your style and approach will dominate your communication. So in other words, you'll probably be using it too often. And because you're using it too often and you're not conscious of what you're doing, then you'll find that you're being less effective with other people. How so? Well, for example, if you are very much a structured, logical, factual person, which I know many of you are, then it's likely that you're going to try and influence people with logic, structure, and fact. Now, the problem is the other person may not be influenced by that. In other words, there might be other things they're influenced by. So the second important element is that the other person has a profile as well. Now, they may not have done the influencing capabilities profile, but they still have a predisposition to how they might be influenced. Now, we've all had cases where we've worked with someone and we've tried to influence them and the glaze goes in their eyes. We can see that and we try even harder. But what we try and do is we try even harder using the style or approach that we favour rather than what the other person may favour. So the other person or person's style and approach is important. And the third element is that it depends on the situation or the context as to when you use certain styles or approaches. So, for example, if you have to make a quick decision, then collaboration is probably not a very good strategy to use at that time because you simply don't have the time to talk to everyone. So what you do is you might make a quick decision. So anyway, so now the problem with this, of course, is that you're not sitting there thinking, what's my style? What's the other person's style? What's the situation? We don't think like that. But what I'm suggesting to you is that what you should do is that if plan A doesn't work, try plan B. If plan B doesn't work, try plan C. If C doesn't work, try plan D. In other words, just keep trying things until it works, but don't keep banging on with plan A because quite frankly, it won't always work. And you know that, and I know that. And it's because basically if you divided the world up into influencing strategies or influencing styles and approaches, one quarter would would favour investigation, one quarter would favour calculation, one quarter would favour motivation, and another quarter would favour collaboration. So if you just keep banging on it with your style and approach, you're only going to hit the mark 25% of the time, which probably isn't all that good. But if you're prepared to use all four in the right place with the right people, you're going to significantly bump up your odds of being persuasive. Does that make sense? I hope so. Okay. Now what you're looking at in front of you is the influencing capabilities framework. Now I put this together because I was a bit disillusioned with what was out there in the world of influence. On the one end, if you take a continuum, on one end of the continuum, there was a lot of academic literature on influence that really had no basis in reality. You really couldn't use it particularly well. At the other end of the continuum is a lot of salesy type stuff that really isn't applicable for us in local government or anywhere for that matter. So I kind of thought, well, there must be something in the middle, and there wasn't. So I put together this influencing capabilities framework. And so the profile, of course, fell out of that framework. So if you look at the framework in front of you on the screen, you'll notice that there, first of all, the dimensions of push and pull. So there's a difference between push and pull, and let's just understand what they are. I've just thrown up a little slide there that might help you. So people who like to push are probably a little bit more driving, and they're proposing ideas and they're giving information, and they're taking ideas to the person. And people who like the pull style are more enabling, and they test understanding and they seek out information. So when you look at your scores on the influencing capabilities profile, one of the interesting things to look at is whether you are predisposed to a push or are you predisposed to a pull style. Now, the idea, of course, is to use them both, depending, as I said before, on the circumstances and the people that you're leading. So it's important that you are flexible enough to be able to jump from one to the other. In fact, if I walked up to anyone in your local government organisation who knew you and I explained what push and pull meant and I asked them where they would categorise you, you wouldn't want them to say, "Oh no, she uses the pull style," or "He likes to use the push style," because you've already been typecast, and it's likely that that will create a chain reaction of events. And so, what you need to do is to be very adaptable. Now, the other dimension is over on the left-hand side where you've got logical and emotional approaches. And let me just explain what that's all about. So people who have a tendency towards being logical will use facts and evidence and rationale and structure and measurement. And the opposite's true for those who like to use the emotional approach, where they'll use values and feelings and perceptions, and morale will be important to them and so forth. So if you have a look at your influencing capabilities profile now, you'll notice whether you've got more of a logical or an emotional approach to influence. And again, if you're only banging on with one and not the other, then it's likely that you're going to miss the mark with certain people. Because I think in my experience in local government, if we did this survey right across Queensland and sort of collected all this data about everyone that worked in local government, I'm not convinced that there'd be a skewing towards one particular strategy. I think it's probably fair to say that the majority of people would probably fall in the investigation and calculation quadrants. They would probably be more likely to be logical and emotional. But every one of you in this broadcast do know, if it's not yourself at least, other people that you interact with in your local government organisation who demonstrate symptoms of motivation and collaboration. So it's dangerous to assume that everyone in local government is a logical decision maker. It's not necessarily the case, even though if you are one of them, you may wish everyone else was. But the truth of the matter is, people are often motivated as much by emotion as anything else. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. So what that leads to is 4 influencing strategies. So investigation uses a push style with a logical approach. Calculation uses a pull style with a logical approach. Motivation uses a push style with an emotional approach. And collaboration uses a pull style with an emotional approach. All right, so that gives us a framework to work with. Now, in your influencing capabilities profile, you would have noticed that there was a page like this. And what this page did is it showed you percentages around where you fell in each of those areas that I've discussed. But also, the other thing that's important here is there are 16 capabilities that underpin the 4 influencing strategies. So each of the 4 influencing strategies have 4 capabilities underpinning it. And what's important on this slide and in your report is that you need to look at the scores that are relatively low and relatively high, relative to the other scores, in other words. And what you need to do, and let's just give you an example. So if I looked at this person and I could see there that perhaps offering concessions was the lowest percentages across all 4 influencing capabilities, now I might then decide to work with that person, or if it's my report and it's not, but if it was, I might say, well, you know what, I'm going to make a bit of a commitment to develop that capability because clearly it's not one that's terribly strong. So the reason why this is a great page in your report is you can strategize where you go. Now, let's go to the other end of the spectrum. You'll notice there that this person has scored very high on providing feedback. You see, in fact, it's just underneath. So you might say that's a great strength, and you'd be right. It is, but it could also be overused. So this person could be using that too often at the expense of using another capability that might be more applicable in that situation, you see. So what you need to do is look at your profile and say, well, what am I getting out of this? And not pat yourself on the back too much about getting high scores, but to think to yourself, am I overcommitting to using that capability in the work that I do in local government? So that's a great slide for you and in your profile that you can look at. Now let's talk about each of these 4 styles a bit more, strategies a bit more, and refer back to the people that I mentioned earlier on. And of course, in the inquisitive, which is the adjective to describe the investigator, as I mentioned before, they like to marshal their facts and figures. They will assertively advance their argument, and they'll use logic and persuasion and tend to be methodical and structured in their approach. Al Gore's a great example of that. Al Gore left the White House in 2000. He was vice president under Bill Clinton for 8 years. He lost that very famous, or perhaps we might say infamous, election in 2000 against George W. Bush because there was controversy in Florida in relation to the voting irregularities around the chits that came out of the machines, and it was actually decided in the courts, and so Al Gore narrowly lost the presidency. But since then, he's reinvented himself as a climate change activist, and so he started out by putting together a very sophisticated documentary, if you like, called The Inconvenient Truth. And it's well worth having a look at on YouTube, because not just with the content necessarily, but if you watch his influencing style, you'll notice that it's very methodical and structured, and there are charts and graphs and statistics, and he clearly relies on that investigation style to influence his audience of the need to do something about climate change. So when you think about occupations that actually revolve around the investigator strategy, you think of police, of scientists, of researchers. Police, of course, have to collect a body of evidence in a compelling way to put before a court, and assuming that they have a compelling body of evidence, the person that's being charged is likely to be convicted. And scientists and researchers, of course, will test a hypothesis, and they'll use a rigorous research methodology normally to demonstrate that. So there's three careers where people actually rely on investigation, and each of them are hugely influential if they've done their homework correctly. Now, where you should be using this in your own workplace is when you're doing workplace investigations. So workplace investigations would include safety audits or harassment claims where you're obliged to go and investigate. Now, if you investigate those and you're using a rigorous approach, then it's likely that whatever report you come up with is going to be reasonably influential on the basis of the rigor of the investigation that you put into it. So it's going to be influential. But where you wouldn't use this is on large-scale change initiatives where you want people on board, right? If you want people on board, then you've got to tug at the heartstrings. So you've got to get people on board with both spirit and mind. And of course, that's requiring a completely different emotional approach to influencing. Okay. Now, the clear investigator the clear investigator is, by the way, any questions, pop them in. I'll respond when I see the little hand go up. So calculators like to promote, now don't forget calculators are also logical. So calculators like to promote the positives of a proposal, so they'll talk it up and they'll highlight the weaknesses in the current position. So in other words, they're basically putting you in a corner to say this is the only way to go. People know where they stand with calculators, no question about that. If you've got a high score in calculation, I'll guarantee that's what people would say about you, whether they say it to your face or behind your back is irrelevant, they'd be thinking it. They use logic to advance their cause, and generally calculators are very, very good debaters because they do their homework, they're quite structured, they're quite logical, and they're good at interrogating other people's points of view and also advancing their own. And Margaret Thatcher was such a person. So Margaret Thatcher was Britain's only, to date, female Prime Minister, and Margaret Thatcher ruled the UK for 10 years. And during that time, she was either loved or hated. There wasn't too much in between, and I'm sure you may have an opinion one way or the other about her. I'm not here to necessarily support her policies or denigrate them. I just wanted to talk about her as an influencer. And she was enormously influential, and it's very hard to contradict that. And one of her style, well, of course, her main style and approach was to kind of talk up the proposals. She was a devastating debater in the House of Commons, and she would talk down the opposition or the people who were perhaps against her approach. So it was quite a clear style. And so what sort of occupations use that? Well, salespeople are very much calculators in their methodology. Let me give you an example. The other day I walked past Harvey Norman's. You may not have Harvey Norman's in your town, but I'm sure you've heard of it. Harvey Norman's sell lots of things, including computers, and there was a sign on the door that said 40% off laptops. Well, I thought that's pretty interesting. I wasn't interested in a laptop, but I thought I'll go in and have a look. I did, and then when I got inside the door, there was another sign on the just inside the door that said, "Must purchase by the close of business today in order to get your 40% discount." So you see, what that retailer was doing was using calculation. They were roping me in with the 40% discount, in other words, talking up the pros. And basically, when I got in the door, they made it clear that I had to make a decision immediately. Otherwise, of course, that discount wouldn't be available. So salespeople use that all the time. So do financial advisors. This is the best deal going, and you really need to hurry up to get on the ground floor. Animal trainers use it as well. So when they're, if you go to a circus, if you're young and you take your children to a circus, you'll notice that the ponies that are in the circus, the show ponies, the trainers have got a whip in one hand, and in the other hand they have a box full of treats. So the pony either gets a whip or a treat, and of course the pony will be influenced by avoiding the whip and attracting the treat. And of course many of our teachers at school were who we respected. Hopefully you've got one of those. I'll guarantee to you they used this calculation strategy. So what they do is they draw a line in the sand, and woe betide you if you walked across that line. You knew exactly where you stood. And that's what children need. They need those boundaries. So when would you use it? Well, any new change in your workplace that will affect employees and their working methods requires you to sell the benefits or the positives of the change. So, for example, if you had harassment and bullying legislation training, maybe everyone would take a yawn and go, ho hum, why do we have to do this? But you'd need to talk up what's in it for them on the one hand, And on the other hand, you'd have to talk about the pitfalls of not attending. All right. And so what you're trying to do is create some leverage so that people are influenced to go along with your way of thinking. Now, where that's not going to work very well is in vague situations that are very unclear. So, for example, and this isn't necessarily a local government example, but if you talked about private enterprise, if a business was wanting to open up a new market for a product, then they really need to talk up. They need to explain the big picture, okay? Because people want to know what the big picture is initially, and then perhaps they might want to know the details later on. So motivation would be the right approach in those circumstances. All right, now the mindful motivator. Now, motivators, the difference now is the next two are below the line, so they're using more of an emotional approach than a logical approach. So the mindful motivator. The mindful motivator will tend to influence by talking about the big picture. And what they tend to do is to link their particular proposal with the vision of the organisation. So it might be the corporate plan or the values or the vision statement. They link it very much to the consistency or across local government. And they will create this compelling picture that this really needs to be done or achieved because it fits in. So they're big picture thinkers, basically. They often have a way with words, and they can define a simple and as I say, convincing vision. Martin Luther King was such a person. Dr. Martin Luther King, of course, was a civil rights activist prominent in the 1960s in America. He gave one of the greatest speeches of all time, I Have a Dream, and that speech was presented in, I think it was 1968, and it was 1969 that he was assassinated. But it was enormously influential in the sense that it moved a nation, it moved a generation, it brought into great consciousness the whole notion of civil rights, and many people built upon that. And if you haven't seen the video, I'd strongly recommend you do, because it's a brilliant speech. But one thing that's interesting is that there's no facts in it whatsoever. There is absolutely none. And that's because it wasn't that sort of speech. It was a speech that was full of beautiful rhetoric and words, but it was challenging people to think differently about civil rights. And so it was an example of a mindful motivator in action. Now, advertising entrepreneurs and advertising executives and PR agents and artistic directors, all of these people use motivation as their influencing strategy. So an Elon Musk or a Richard Branson will tend to have a big picture vision. And what they will do is they'll draw around them people who believe in that vision. And then, of course, they will work towards that. So where you would use this in your own local government environment is that if you're trying to develop a new strategic direction, so if you're a fairly senior manager, that might be the case, or even if you're not, you might want a new direction for your team or a new priority. And you want people engaged and committed to that priority, then being a mindful motivator would be the way to go. On the other hand, if people are unclear about the rationale for a new initiative, so for example, there's cost cutting, then they want to know the facts first. They want to know basically the answer to two questions. One is, where are the cuts taking place? And secondly, am I affected? That's what they want to know before they want to know about any big picture. So you can see using the wrong approach at the wrong time probably isn't going to be effective. We've all been there and we've all done that. Okay, now the collegial collaborator are people who will influence using emotion, just like the motivators. The big difference is that collaborators will try to influence people to be part of a team, whereas the motivators will try and influence people to buy into a vision. But they persuade people by involving them in the decision. So collaborators are actually great team builders, and they try to engage people's hearts and minds at the task at hand. And Mother Teresa comes readily to mind. She's been anointed as a saint by the Catholic Church over the last couple of years for her work in the streets of Calcutta and other parts of the world that are very, very poverty-stricken, where she's gone in and devoted her whole life to helping the extremely poverty-stricken people in those streets. And what she's been able to do is to collaborate and bring in NGOs and bring in governments and bring in stakeholders and wealthy donors and, of course, a whole bunch of volunteers as well to make a serious impact in those parts of the world. So I use her as an example of somebody who is clearly a collegial collaborator. And again, like the other four, there are controversies about her, and I'm sure, people have read stories and all the rest of it. But at the end of the day, you have to admire the fact that she's achieved great things, and she clearly did that using a particular influencing strategy, and that's the big picture. So people, conductors of orchestras, for example, are collaborators because they don't actually play a musical instrument. If you think about it, what they do is they orchestrate or facilitate or collaborate a beautiful ensemble using the various instruments in the orchestra at different times. Funeral directors have to bring together a funeral dealing with a lot of people that are reluctantly involved and to make it a harmonious and functioning service. You've got choreographers who are trying to put a show together who have to appeal to the egos of people and to try and convince them that, what's in the best interests of them is, in fact, in the best interests of everyone and get them to work together as a team. Now, you'd use this when you're trying to convince people who have diverse and strongly held views. So let's say in your local government environment, this is not unusual, as I'm sure you'd agree. Let's say there's another department or a team that's not communicating with your team. Heaven forbid. I'm sure that happens. Now, what might be a smart strategy to get them to work better is to bring both teams together, to get the leader of that team and yourself, and basically then nut out the differences. And you set a few ground rules at the beginning, and you might say to the team, look, few ground rules, please respect people's points of view, don't talk over the top of them, and we want to walk out of here with some resolutions about how we'll improve our capacity to communicate. And then you let them go and keep them on track, of course, all the way through. That would be a very powerful way to create and influence change because they would end up convincing themselves, but instead of sweeping it under the carpet. But if people need to know the logic and the rationale behind a decision, they're not interested in collaborating. They need to know what the logic is behind it. So, for example, if you brought in a new customer relationship management system in your council, then you're going to have a lot of people jumping up and down about it, complaining that there's nothing wrong with the old system. So probably getting everyone together and saying, we've got to work together and make this work is probably premature. It might be better to explain the rationale for why that change has been made and perhaps talk about the pros and cons, i.e. calculation, before you start collaborating. Once you've done that, of course, collaboration would be very effective. So I've shown you this slide before. This is the profile this is the page that's in your profile. And as I said at the outset, it's a good idea for you to select some of the ones that perhaps you have relative low scores on and relative high scores on, and ask yourself the question, am I using this too much or am I using this too little? And think about what you can do about that. Now, let's just finish up. We've got about 15 minutes. I'll just check to see if we've got any questions. No, all good. So I'm either explaining this very well or you're completely and utterly confused. I'm hoping it's the former rather than the latter. Okay. If you were trying to improve your capacity to investigate, so let's say you've got a relatively low score in investigation compared with the other three strategies, then here's some tips for you. How about you try using third-party endorsement? Now, what I mean by that is that if there's somebody credible inside your organisation or even in another local government who's actually implemented a system or a process or something, and they've done it extremely effectively and they've got high credibility, then why not draw upon their experience to perhaps influence the people that you might be working with about the virtues of that particular approach? So you could, I mean, if you have got the luxury of bringing them into a team meeting, that's great, but you may not. You could certainly, at the very least, quote them and what's happened with their experiences and explain that you've been on the phone talking to them about what they did and you've got some really good ideas that worked successfully there and so forth. So that can work. Of course, when we interview people in local government, in fact, in any sort of form of employment, what we tend to do is ask structured, people get the same questions, so everyone gets the same set of questions. And apart from the concept of fairness, what we're attempting to do there is to justify a decision. So once we've made a decision on somebody getting the job, we can do that on the basis that we have a process that's quite rigorous. So structured interviews are very effective. Conducting any survey, assuming it's reasonably credible, is highly effective because that's why we're surveyed out. That's why everybody follows and looks at survey results, because it's an influencing strategy and it means that it's done credibly. Just think, for example, about opinion polls. Do politicians pay attention to opinion polls? I think they do, and it has huge impact. It can actually destroy a leader of a party's credibility overnight and so forth. So it has enormous impact. The other thing that you might like to think about is process mapping. And you can see on the page there's a process, a very simple process for something. You could actually map out all the different steps in a particular process. So it might be an application from the public, or it could be a process of how a report is written, whatever it might be. And if you involved your team in this exercise, you are combining two influencing strategies. You're combining collaboration because it's a team effort, and because you're using process mapping, you're involved in investigation. And whenever you can combine two of these, of course, they become extremely powerful. So you sit down with your team and you strategize about how you can improve a process. You ask them to tell you where the pinch points are in the process. You work with them to work out ways and means of making that process even more effective. And that's really important. So we bang on about innovation and continuous improvement in local government, but one of the best places to start is to look at the processes that we actually have in place and actually start with them and see if we can improve them in some way, shape or form. And that can be enormously rewarding and does fulfill that mantra about innovation and continuous improvement. Okay, now moving right along, calculation. Now, calculation, of course, is still a logical style, and here's some approaches that you might use. A gentleman by the name of Kurt Lewin came up with the concept of the force field analysis, and I'm sure many of you have come across it before because it's very, very popular. In fact, he became famous for drawing a line down the centre of his page, and on the left-hand side he'd write a heading saying driving forces, and on the right-hand side he'd write a heading saying restraining forces. And it's pretty much a tool of analysis where you can look at all the forces for the change and all the forces against the change. Now, again, if you do this in a team environment, it's even more powerful because the fact of the matter is you're combining collaboration with calculation. And then you brainstorm with your team all the driving forces, and then you brainstorm all the restraining forces. And then you consider how can you minimize some of the driving forces and how can you maximize some of the restraining forces. Sorry, how can you minimize some of the restraining forces and maximize some of the driving forces. So that works well. And then, of course, you've got the good old cost-benefit analysis. And a cost-benefit analysis is really an analytical tool to influence people to spend money or open the coffers or increase the budget or whatever it might be. So if the benefits of a proposal clearly outweigh the costs, then it's going to be influential, isn't it? People are likely to do it, notwithstanding other factors, they're likely to do it. On the other hand, if the costs outweigh the benefits, then perhaps we need a rethink because it's not likely that it's going to get up. But the other thing that I don't see enough in local government, which is a shame, is the after-action review, which is something that most military organisations do on a daily basis. So whenever they've done a piece of training or a project or whatever it might be, they actually ask themselves 3 fundamental questions. And again, this can be done collaboratively with your team. So it's like a debrief. So the first question is, what went well? Now, what went well, we always start with the positive. Even if it was a disaster, there must have been something in the process that went well. Then we might ask, what didn't go well? And even if it was an absolute success story, there's always something that didn't go well. And then, of course, the last question is, so what did we learn about this for future? And it's very powerful. It's short, sharp, to the point, and effective. And what happens is the team are usually committed to the outcomes, that is the learnings, because they've been involved in the solution. So again, you might want to think about doing that. Motivation tools, you've got a team values charter, and I can perhaps share with you what that's all about at a slightly later date. The GROW model, again, you can Google GROW, and it's a very, very powerful way of getting people to see the big picture and get them to work towards a solution rather than leaning on you and putting the monkey on your back. Storytelling is very effective. Now, you don't have to be an Enid Blyton or a J.K. Rowling or whoever. Honestly, just tell people a story about when you did something wrong, when you did it wrong. Let's say you're trying to convince your team about some situation where you didn't consult. Let's say you're trying to convince your team that you need to consult another department before you launch in and make a decision, right? That's a simple area that you want to influence other people in. Now, you can say it and give them a lecture. Not likely to be effective. But what about if you tell them a story about when you learnt your lesson several years ago when you didn't consult the department and something happened and it cost you all this time, effort, and energy? That's more likely to influence because people don't forget stories. They like them. We're brought up on them. And of course, speaking of stories, why don't you start your meetings with good news stories? I just, for the life of me, can't understand why I don't see much of this. How about we just go around the table and say, win for the week? So we're asking each person to just give us one simple win for the week. And you'll see people sitting there going, oh, gee, I don't know. I can't think of anything that's happened that was good during the week, which is kind of sad, isn't it, really? But by asking them that question, what you're doing is you're getting them to start thinking positively about their working environment because let's face it, you're going to be going for the jugular shortly and talk about all the problems. So you might as well get out all the positives that have happened. It also helps you to hear around the table. You'll find it works really well, and I've used that quite a lot. Finally, let's talk about collaboration, then we're just about done. If you've got any questions, now's the time to ask. Collaboration tools. Okay. The late and great Stephen Covey, a la the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, talked about the phrase begin with the end in mind, or the sentence begin with the end in mind. And what he was basically saying is that a good thing for a leader to do is have a very clear vision of what you want, and then allow your team to work towards a solution for that. So if you explain the outcome, which of course is motivation, then you can actually get them involved. So you might say, look, we've got an hour. What I'm hoping to achieve in this session is blah, blah, blah. And I want you to commit to spending that hour working together. And my role in all of this is to just keep you honest, keep you on track. And you let them go. You'll be surprised how effective that is. With Unit 1, of course, in the Lunch and Learn series was all around giving effective feedback, and there it is again. It's also a collaboration tool. So obviously, because giving feedback, you've got to exchange views and talk to people. So it's a collaborative tool, isn't it? Using a problem-solving approach with involving other people is a critically important thing to do as well. And just actively listening and paraphrasing is very powerful as well, because it lets the person know that you're actually engaged in the conversation with them. So it's a collaborative tool. All right, so we've covered what influence is and what it isn't. We've talked about the influencing capabilities framework. I've shown you examples of the 4 influencing strategies in action. And we have shared with you some tools of influence. So my book has about 64 tools in it, and I've only just scratched the surface and shared with you, half a dozen, if not a few more. All right, so where are we going next? In 2 weeks' time, we'll be looking at optimizing team performance. In the meantime, I'm going to give you some homework, as I mentioned at the outset, and here it is. And like all this homework is practical, it's there to help you, so please have a go. Your homework between now and in a fortnight is to complete the profile if you haven't already done so, and I think most of you have from looking at the names, and implement at least one of the tools you've learnt. In other words, I want you to go out and practice your influencing skills immediately. Start this afternoon and get used to it, and I think if you do that, it'll stand you in very good stead. So, guys, that's pretty much it. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you. It's been great working with you, and I really wish you all the very best. If you've got questions now, send me an email. So thanks, guys. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thank you.